To our dads this morning, we wish all of you a happy Father's Day, and we'll say more about that at the next hour, as you might imagine, but happy Father's Day to you guys. And as we said in prayer, it is the recovery time from VBS. Hope you've had some time to do that. It was a busy week, it was a tiring week, but it was a very, I think, beneficial week, and I appreciate all who helped in whatever capacity you might have served during Vacation Bible School, and I'll certainly say more about that at the next hour as well. This morning we continue to think about how can we serve like Jesus? How are we to live our lives in service to others, service to God, and how are we to do that, again, using Jesus as our supreme example? This morning, Luke chapter 6, verses 17 to 49, is a lengthy reading, and I'm not going to take time, although it would be beneficial to read this in its entirety. This is Luke's account of what is commonly known as the Sermon on the Plain. Much more well known is the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And there is debate among those who study these things and trouble themselves about it, whether this sermon in Luke is the same one in Matthew or not. And probably if you were to pin me down and say, do you think it's the same exact sermon, I would say no, I think they were presented at two different times. But much of the content is very similar and familiar. And so, for instance, when you begin reading in verse 20 of Luke chapter 6, you hear Jesus say, "Blessed." And those beatitude statements that are more, again, commonly referenced in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 3 to 12, these in Luke are similar, although there are some differences, and that leads me to suspect, again, that Jesus was just giving this sermon at a different time, not that he's contradicting what he said elsewhere, but just adapting to the need and to the situation and the circumstance that he might find himself in. But be that as it may, this morning, if you've got the workbook, you'll notice that our lesson title is Serving Without Expectation. Serving without expectation. What do you mean by that? Well, what are expectations? Dr. Elizabeth Scott, she phrased it this way from a medical and psychological perspective. This might be, if you will, kind of a clinical definition. Expectations are what we think will happen, while reality is what actually transpires. I think that's a good statement in a nutshell. What we think will happen, while reality is what actually transpires. While we hope these two will match up, they often don't. This disparity of expectations versus reality can often lead to feelings of discontentment and unhappiness. And all of us have, I'm sure, more than once been the victim of unmet expectations or unrealistic expectations. And by way of introduction, I tell you that sometimes one of the first things that Amy and I try to do with a couple that wants to engage our services for premarital counseling is to try to investigate their expectations. You know, what are you thinking about as you are now, at least coming to us at this stage, stating that you're planning on spending the rest of your lives together. You want to get married. You want this man to be your husband, this woman to be your wife. And the practice is especially incredibly enlightening if we can separate the couple and do some one-on-one, because when you have the other partner in the room with you, almost without fail, before one answers, they'll kind of look at the other and say, okay, how am I going to phrase this to make sure they have my approval and how I'm wording it? And she'll do the same for him and he'll do the same for her. And if you can do this kind of separate, it gets a lot more, I guess, open and a lot more real, if you want to say it that way. So, most men think their future wife will be some combination of June Cleaver, Rachel Green, and Wonder Woman. If you don't know exactly who all those people are, they're just a lot of cultural pop references there. Try to get kind of the whole gamut of age groups there. June Cleaver, if you watch June Cleaver and you're getting married in 2024, you're going to be disappointed, aren't you? Because June always was well put together. She was in her nice dress and high heels, and the house looked immaculate, and supper was ready, and, everything was just as it should be. Beaver misbehaved sometimes. This is the Leave It to Beaver black and white TV show. If you don't have any clue what I'm watching, go back and pick it up. But, is that what you can expect? Rachel Green from Friends, Jennifer Aniston, of course, her real name. Are you looking for some type of adventure like she might provide? Or Wonder Woman, I don't know what. You can use your own imagination. We'll just kind of leave that there. Well, what do women think? Well, they think they'll be marrying a combination of Tom Cruise, Peyton Manning, and Prince Charming. You've got all the guys kind of rolled up there into one. He's got to have the good looks of Tom Cruise. He's got to be athletic and strong like Peyton, and then maybe like a Prince Charming, he still has to be sweet and meet all the Disney princess expectations, right? So which of those, do I put it there? Yeah. Which of those is correct? Or which partner is correct in wanting this from the other? Well, of course, neither. You might get every once in a while a little snippet of one of those three or some others, but you're not going to get all the complete package, either in a husband or a wife in that regard. But unrealistic expectations that are unaddressed or understood are one of the leading sources of conflict in marriage. Actually, what we do in premarital counseling is an assessment, and part of that assessment starts off, well, it doesn't start off, but it kind of does start off. I'll take it back. I'm kind of going through a couple of different sections, but it gives you, what are you planning as it regards to get from this relationship? And not only what are you planning to get, more importantly, what are you planning to give? And how are you going to kind of mesh those two together? And so I think it's a very helpful tool to try to, at the very start, understand expectations. But because, again, if they are unaddressed and not understood and unrealistic, then, of course, problems can very easily and do often result. H. Norman Wright, another expert in that particular field, he said, if you plan to marry, it is certain that you have a preconceived fantasy of your ideal mate or the perfect marriage. After a while, you will begin to realize that your fantasy and the person you have married will diverge sharply. At that point, you embark upon a reform program. And he's probably right. And we've all tried that. And we might try to reform or change others, even our own spouses. And that's a dangerous process to attempt. And we look for warning flags especially. And you've probably heard it, and you know the wisdom of, trying to warn people about making statements like, well, I know that's how he is now, but after we get married, he'll change, or he'll do different, or I'll convince him otherwise. Or, yes, she may exhibit that character flaw now, but, there's just great danger in making assumptions such as those expectations. And it's not to say that we can't change or grow or mature. We all must. And that's something, though, that by and large, even though others can influence us, those things have to be really our own enterprise and of our own motivation. But marriage is not the only area of life where unrealistic expectations cause difficulty, and you know that. Workplace expectations often need to be revised. And if you are working for someone else, they may have expectations of you that are beyond what you're capable of giving. If you are the one that's, in a position of authority or a managerial or whatever sort of role where you have others working for you, you have to be careful that your expectations of them are not greater than what they should be. Here's one job qualification characteristic list. This is the type of person needed. He has to have the strength of an ox, the tenacity of a bulldog, the daring of a lion, the wisdom of an owl, the harmlessness of a dove, the industry of a beaver, the gentleness of a sheep, the versatility of a chameleon, the vision of an eagle, the height of a rhinoceros, the perspective of a giraffe, the endurance of a camel, the bounce of a kangaroo, the stomach of a horse, the disposition of an angel, the loyalty of an apostle, the faithfulness of a prophet, the tenderness of a shepherd, the devotion of a mother. And still he could not please everybody. Now, someone wrote that, of course, tongue-in-cheek. In jest, can you guess what particular occupation they were trying to describe? An engineer, Victor says. A preacher, that's the more correct answer, but we'll let Victor believe it's an engineer too. Yeah, engineers and preachers, but maybe we share some similarities except in the math aptitude department. But anyways, we all, sometimes, we have these ideas, these lofty goals. Here's what the person needs to be. And I've studied this a little bit, not at length, but it's especially been the case, noticing some trends since all of COVID. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent. I've got to steer the bus back on the road, but I'm going to take this brief detour. Expectations, during COVID and whatever you want to say, the pandemic ramifications and fallout, a lot of things in the workplace have changed. And it's interesting now, is it called silent quitting, Victor, or something like that? Silently quitting. Well, what do you mean silently quitting? Well, it means I just let my job performance just kind of gradually slide until the boss, looks and says, I don't think we need you here anymore. And supposedly that's a good thing, or somehow, I'm lowering my performance for whatever reason, maybe so that they can, relieve me of my duties or whatever. I don't know. I don't get that. But that's just something that's kind of happened with the recent changes in our culture at large. There are other things that, sometimes happen. Even I had a little bit of difficulty, and all of us that have went through any type of university program know that at some point you usually go either for a class or at least a weekend seminar or a period of time where the career people try to help you understand how to interview well and how to present yourself in that environment. And, you never talk about your weaknesses, or if you do, you always couch them in some other term. So, they come in, they say, okay, we've looked over your resume, things look good, just, tell me, what do you feel like your weak point is? Well, I just work too hard. I'm just a workaholic. I can't help it. I come in early and I stay late. And, you have to maximize your weaknesses, and it almost feels like some sort of sanctified lying, even in that department. But nevertheless, that's the world we live in. You say, what does that have to do with following Jesus? Well, you come to Matthew, or you can come to Matthew 5, 6, and 7, but we're in Luke chapter 6. Come to Luke chapter 6, and Jesus is talking about what are the characteristics of those people who will be citizens of His kingdom, that will be followers of His. And like I said, just as in Matthew 5, in Luke chapter 6 and verse 20, He begins with these statements of blessed are. And our summer series, we're going to do the Sermon on the Mount, so we'll look at those in Matthew chapter 5. And the paradoxes are apparent. Blessed are you poor, He says in verse 20, for yours is the kingdom of God. Now typically, I would imagine that, every red-blooded American, if you were just to give them a test and say, do the words blessed and poor go together? At least 9 out of 10 people would shake their head in disagreement and say, no, if you're poor, you're not blessed. And if you're blessed, you're not poor. That's just kind of the way that we think about it in today's terms. Those terms just can't be meshed together. But Jesus said they could be. You can be blessed and you can be poor. Verse 21, you can be hungry and you can be blessed. Again, we think the words don't fit together at all. You can weep and be blessed. You can be hated, verse 22, and be blessed. And you remember that Matthew even adds some additional ones as he records Jesus' statements. And we shake our heads and we say, Lord, that doesn't make sense. I'm blessed when I don't have to worry about my finances, if there's more month left at the end of the money. Lord, I'm blessed when I don't have to be sad or sorrowful. I'm blessed when everything in life is running smoothly. I'm in good health. My family's in good health. No one's suffering sickness or disease, and there's not been a death in recent times. That's when I'm blessed. Lord, I'm blessed when I'm happy. And oftentimes, of course, defining happiness is on my own terms, things going the way that I want them to be. And yet Jesus said there are, for those who would be His followers, instances when we can be poor, hungry, when we can be in sorrow, when we can even be hated and still be blessed if we're following Him. And we're putting our attention and priority on things that are spiritual in nature. being more like Jesus. And that's a challenge. And it's a challenge that people have faced from the time that Jesus spoke these words up to the present. But here's how, and Jesus says it, and I would have loved just to have tried to see the look on people's faces when he said, rejoice. This is Luke 6:23. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. When was the last time you were so happy you jumped for joy? Can you remember that? Maybe it was on the golf course and, you made a 40-foot putt for probably double bogey for me. That would have been a time that I leaped for joy. At least it's not to triple this hole. When was the last time you actually leaped for joy, if you can remember? Indeed, your reward is great in heaven, for in like manner their fathers did to the prophets. Now, what he's just talked about, he said, when you, for my sake, are mistreated, that's when you leap for joy. And again, we would say, Lord, that's not possible. But read the book of Acts. What happens after Peter and John are arrested, threatened, imprisoned, and then told not to preach anymore? Do they leave the prison with their heads between their knees and shoulders slumped and saying, well, this Jesus idea, it was a good idea, but I guess it's over now? Is that how they responded? Not at all. They rejoiced. They gave thanks to God in prayer that they were able to suffer. They went right back to preaching and teaching, what Jesus had told them to do. They're arrested again, and, the authorities bring them back in, and they're kind of dumbfounded. They said, boys, this is the Alan Judd version, boys, didn't you understand the first time? We told you we didn't want to hear any more about that. They said, well, we know, we heard you, we comprehended what you said, but whether it's right on the side of God to serve you or to serve Him, we think you guys are smart enough to figure that out. We're going to serve God, so do with us what you will. So they lived by these words of Jesus, and so should we. Now, just continuing very quickly to kind of highlight what Jesus means by serving without expectation. In verse 27, he switches gears and he said, I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who spitefully use you. And again, we throw up our hands in objection and say, now wait a minute, Jesus. Wait a minute. I can maybe I can still look at my perspective on circumstances and say they're not ideal, but if I'm living for you and still this is, what you've chosen to bring into my life, I can maybe accept that. But now you're wanting me to be more proactive and not just reactive. Now you're telling me to love my enemies. That's something I have to do. That doesn't come naturally. And maybe a lot of us have tried to excuse ourselves from the real punch of what Jesus is demanding by saying, well, I don't have any enemies. Well, if you don't, count yourself fortunate. Now, it's true when we think about our enemies, again, maybe our minds just automatically go to the evening news, and we look at the bad guys in the Middle East or, somewhere else that's, interested in doing acts of terror. And certainly there are those people in the world. We know we live in a world where that happens. But here, enemies, while we think it to be a strong word, it may just be those people that sometimes, let's just say it maybe in a simple way, that they just make things hard for us. Maybe it is that coworker that just is always, trying to push your button. Or it's that person at school that's always going to ridicule you or make fun of you no matter what. You don't have the right shoes or the right dress or the right brand of shirt or something else. There's someone that's an enemy. There's someone that's opposing you. Jesus said, well, love them and do good to them even if they hate you. Well, Jesus, that's awful hard. That's difficult. That's not natural. Of course it's not natural. It's His way. Bless those who curse you. He goes on, the one that strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you. And from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And while, again, maybe culturally this was something that would have been more commonplace in that day and time than it is in our day, certainly this principle is still operative no matter the age in which we live. Verse 31, echoing Matthew 7, verse 12, just as you want men to do to you, just as you want people to do to you, you also do to them likewise. Or as we more commonly have put it kind of in our phraseology, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that principle is always operative, that law, sometimes called the golden rule. It's golden because of its beauty and because of the idea that if everyone would just live by it, and if we were all in a constant state of attempting to, outdo one another in fulfilling this command, what a world we would live in. But of course, that's not the world we live in. That doesn't even happen in our own families. That doesn't happen between spouses. That doesn't happen between siblings. I'm sure it fell on deaf ears. Adrian could confirm if he wants to, and I don't want him to, but it probably fell on deaf ears when he would get into squabbles with his brothers and his brothers with him, and Dad trying to be the mediator and peacemaker would say, well, is that the way you would want him to treat you? And brothers are just mean enough to say, well, yeah, he can give it to me and I'll give it back, and then we can really have it out. So is that some sort of justification, Dad? Or ringing the bell, ding, 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 okay, let's go together. That's not what we mean, of course. But that's serving without expectation. Well, I won't take you through all of the rest of the sermon just at this point. We need to get through some of the other points down through here. We call them our foundation statements. These are the things that kind of where we try to put a practical spin on things. Expectations affect both our attitude and our actions. And you may say, well, is there a connection with service in that regard? Well, yes, there's a connection between attitude and action. I'm actually going to have you turn back to Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 to see this a bit more clearly, even than I think what Luke records for us. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, for instance, this statement is familiar to most. But Jesus, to the original hearers, when he made this statement, it would have been a shocking one. It would have been one of those that maybe he paused after he said it for dramatic effect, and as he paused for dramatic effect, the guy sitting next to you may have elbowed you in the ribs, or your spouse, if they were sitting next to you listening to Jesus, might have elbowed you in the ribs, or whispered, and said, did I just hear him say what I thought I heard him say? Well, what did he say? Jesus said, I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds, goes beyond, is greater than the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And again, we don't know, we don't have an audio recording of how Jesus delivered these words, but maybe he paused and just let that kind of sink in slowly. And if he did, then again, I think it might have been very well the case that someone would have said, did he really say that? He just said, our righteousness. Now, righteousness is just one of those big words that we don't use outside of a church building too often in 2024, but it just means doing the right thing. So doing the right thing, which is what we should be concerned with, because God's way is the right thing to do in all situations and circumstances. So doing the right thing, okay, I'm on board with that idea, Jesus. But he said that righteousness, you're doing the right thing, must exceed the right doing of the scribes and Pharisees. Many, if not all, that the scribes and Pharisees in the days of Jesus were the religious, give you a technical term here, the bigwigs. That's not really a technical term, is it? But they were the people that everyone looked to say, well, these are the most godly, righteous people in all of our society. The scribes, all they did all day was take the Bible and copy it by hand. There was no copying machine. There was no printing press. And so for additional copies of the Bible to be made, it was the tedious process that someone just had to open a scroll and write it out, copy it word by word, letter by letter, by hand for hours on end. And so these guys knew God's Word up and down, backwards and forwards. And so they were considered, again, at the top of the heap for righteousness. The Pharisees, their very name, it's capitalized there. They're kind of almost like a quasi-political religious party. It means they were the separated ones. That's what they called themselves. And by that, they meant, hey, we're separated from you. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, that means we're up here and you're down here. We serve God so well that we far surpass just you common people in your devotion to God. Now, some of them, not all of them, might have taken, that attitude. Some of them were more humble. Jesus encounters a few of them during his ministry. And what percentage of these men were that arrogant and prideful, and which of them were more humble in their outlook, I cannot say with certainty. But nevertheless, they were, the scribes and Pharisees, again, without doubt, considered the most righteous of all the people in the first century world in which Jesus lived. But Jesus said, your right doing must exceed theirs. Now, the right question to ask at this point is how or why? Why did Jesus say that our righteousness must exceed theirs? What was their righteousness based upon or driven by? Well, you have to turn to chapter 6 to have the answer to that question. In chapter 6, verse 2, Jesus said, when you do a charitable deed, some of the versions say when you give your alms, it's referring to offering a financial gift in worship to God, of course. When you do your charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. Now, those who have investigated this text and this sermon in great detail through the years have suggested it's possible that Jesus may have been using hyperbole here. He's exaggerating to make a point. Others would say, no, he's actually stating what would have been a practice of some in that day. Now imagine, as we have our act of worship, we'll do this, of course, at the next hour, when there is a time to offer, when there is a time to give of our financial means for the support and work of the church. We typically have our little plates or baskets, whatever type of receptacle, and we just unassumingly pass them from one person to the next. We have some men that assist us with that, and we just try to do it in a very humble manner. We try to do it in a way that doesn't draw any undue attention to any one person. But can you imagine just someone sitting back there, and as those receptacles for collecting of that money begin to be distributed, he stands up or she stands up and says, I've just had a windfall from an investment, and I want to tell you just how holy I desire to be this morning. My righteous convictions tells me that I should give 30% of this capital gains or whatever. He can use all type of flowery financial terms. So this morning, a check for $100,000 will be placed in the collection basket as it's passed. Well, I don't know what kind of response we would have to a situation like that, but apparently something to that effect, a similar scenario was occurring. These guys sounded a trumpet, and I'm going in to give. It's almost comical to see. In verse 7, Jesus continues. He said, when you pray, don't use vain repetitions as the heathen do. They think they will be heard for their many words. I've heard some guys pray, and I was sitting there as I was trying to follow along as God tells us to do, with my head bowed and eyes closed. And I thought to myself, maybe I was mistaken. I thought I was preaching this morning and they were praying. And that's just kind of the wrong way to look at it too. Maybe I should let them preach and I'll just pray. Verse number 16 to 18, Jesus said, when you fast, don't look like the hypocrites do. And he says, make it appear as if you're fasting not at all. So with that kind of then as an addition to what he said in Matthew 5:20, your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and scribes. Their motivation was what? They did all that they did only to be seen by others. And we've left a lot of it out, but Jesus said, for instance, in Matthew 6, verse 5, he said, they do it to be seen by men, and assuredly, if that's the motivation from which they're doing it, they will have their reward. In other words, that's all the reward they'll get. They're not doing anything that will garner God's favor. If I just do what I do in a religious context, whether that's, I think, even what we would say within the confines of this building on Sundays, or whether it's even out in the world Monday through Saturday, if I just do what I do in a religious context or for the service of God so that others can praise me instead of Him, that's the only reward I'm going to get. Yes? That's an excellent point. Doug says that attitude cost Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. You're absolutely right. They saw people bringing money to the church. That's a good thing to do. And they saw people, impressed in their response to those who were giving. And so Ananias and Sapphira sold a piece of property, and they brought it, the Bible says, and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now the problem was, you have to read all, I think it's about 12 or 13 verses, the first dozen or so in Acts chapter 5, they kept part of it back. But they passed it off as if they were giving it all, as if it were a great sacrifice. Again, we don't know the percentages. To make the math easy, if they sold the property for $1,000, maybe they were going to give $900. They only kept $100 back. But they made it seem as if they were giving the total price. Now you'd say, well, they gave 90%. That's great. And it would be, but it was again this idea that motivated them just to receive the praise that people would give them. And both of them, as Doug rightly points out, paid dearly, paid with their life for such a foolish, a foolish idea as that. So expectations affect both our attitude and our actions. What is our attitude in doing what we do and why we do it, and then what actions accompany it? And you can kind of see both play off each other. You can put them in either order you want to. And that kind of leads us to this second follow-up idea that's maybe just a restatement of the first. Perspective is as important as practice. What do you mean by that? Perspective is as important as practice. Sometimes people would probably disagree with the statement that attitude is as important as action. They'd say, well, I think your actions are more important than your attitude. Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure that you could lean on one to the exclusion of the other. And for this way of thinking, Matthew chapter 23, you'll find Jesus at the close of his ministry, shortly before he dies on the cross, issuing a series of statements. The way many of our English versions translate it, they say, woe to you, W-O-E. It's not a curse. Jesus isn't trying to use vulgar language here. Of course, that wouldn't characterize him as God's holy and divine sinless Son. But he is saying, woe to you in the sense of judgment is coming upon you because of. You stand condemned, scribes and Pharisees, you're hypocrites. And really that word, after he says scribes and Pharisees, would of course arouse the attention of all who heard. But you're just pretenders. You're just those people who are wearing a face like an actor and an actress in a play. You're pretending to be something you're not. And verse 25, you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of extortion and self-indulgence. If you think about just washing dishes today, if you have some sort of, vessel, and maybe you've got your lasagna in your lasagna pan, and the cheese bubbled over and it got all on the outside of it, and you scrub off the grease and the cheese that bubbled on the outside, but still the inside where the food actually was, you left untouched. You'd say, well, that's not clean. But Jesus is making a point. That's kind of what you guys try to do. You try to just clean the outside and leave the inside dirty. Verse 27, you're like a whitewashed tomb. You appear beautifully outward, or you appear beautiful outwardly, but inside you're full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. The Jews, and we know this of course from the burial of Jesus, would bury people back in a cave. We think of digging a hole and burying someone in the ground. They would kind of carve out in a limestone cave and kind of put a body back in there and then roll a larger stone in front of it to keep out the animals and other sorts of things. And they would take then and make a mixture of gypsum and limestone that has a lot of crystal silica in it and kind of paint on the outside. And when that happens, the easiest way I think about it, it's kind of like glitter or rhinestones. When the sun would hit it, it would sparkle. Now, are there any sparkly tombstones today? I've not sold one of that variety. Miss Pat may let me sell her one of these days. She's a sparkly lady, and I say that lovingly. But anyway, typically we would think, well, that's kind of out of place. But Jesus said, you look good, it looks impressive, but it still doesn't hide the fact that it's a tomb. And so, are your attitudes and actions lining up or not? Flipping to the back page, we'll go quickly through this part. Again, I've told you this part already about the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, the differences between the two. We don't have to go that, but here's the points of application. Service frequently involves a shift in thinking. And that's what the paradox, I think, of the Beatitudes are all about. The true status or measure of being blessed, Jesus said, has to be recalibrated in our minds. Being blessed doesn't just mean that everything's going the way that I want it to go, and everything is operating according to my wants and wishes and desires. Blessedness comes, favorability, standing in the sight of God that is acceptable, comes when I put my trust and dependence upon Him and serve Him faithfully, and then allow Him to dictate or to, if you will, work out whatever outcomes He chooses in a particular situation. And so service frequently involves a shift in thinking. We think, well, if I do this, then I ought to get that. And again, that happens in a church setting. That happens in a workplace setting. That happens in a home setting. Again, between fathers and sons and daughters and mothers and even husbands and wives. You know, I've done this, so you should do that. Well, Jesus, to the contrary, says just serve without those expectations. Serve because serving is the right thing to do. Serving is the right thing to do in imitation of Jesus. Yes?
I think that sometimes their attitudes and their thinking is really like behind their actions.
Sure.
And so occasionally, as you are growing, sometimes it is helpful to fake it till you make it. It's a lot easier to get the actions right than it is the heart. But can you get the actions right while you're working to get the heart doing it?
I think so. Carol has mentioned the old memorable mantra, fake it till you make it. And I think that's true. Sometimes our heart has to kind of catch up with our actions. We may say, well, I don't understand why I should do this, or it's not fair, or I'm doing this and yet still I'm getting no recognition, or I'm getting no reward. Hopefully our heart and mind catches up eventually. I don't have it anywhere on your handout, I don't think, but is it Hebrews chapter... I don't remember the chapter in Hebrews, but the Hebrew writer says, God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love that you've performed in His name. In other words, even if no one else sees, even if no one else gives you credit or proper recognition, the Hebrew writer says, remember God does. And sometimes that's hard for our minds to latch onto. And God doesn't do it just, to give you a check mark on His grading sheet, but He does it if you're doing it because He's understanding that you're trying to do it, hopefully out of love and devotion to Him. And so I think we can sometimes just kind of wait for our heart and mind to catch up with the actions we're taking. Service means we get according to how we give. Now, this almost sounds a bit contradictory to what we've been trying to say in this lesson about expectation, but we will receive based on our willingness to give the same in some regards. Jesus in Luke chapter 6, verse 31 to 38, one commentator called this the scoop in, scoop out kind of analogy. Jesus said, if you only love people that love you, what good is that? If you give to people who are going to give back to you, what are you going to gain? Love your enemies instead. Lend to people who can't give you anything in return. He's not just talking, I think, there about financial. There is in this section, verse 31 to 38, the question that's posed more than once. What credit is it to you? What good does it do you if? Jesus is asking. And so service can mean getting according to how we give. And then number 3, by way of application, service requires us to examine ourselves. Verse 39 to 49, Jesus echoing what He says in Matthew chapter 6, this is the speck section. That is, why do we go around always trying to pull specks out of people's eyes when there's a beam in our own eye? We have our own big problems to deal with, so we should look at our own issues first. Someone says, I need to look at me before I look at thee, to use that old type of language, and maybe that's true. Look at me instead of thee. Are we serving for people praise or God's praise? We've already seen the result. If I'm only serving for people praise, that's all I'll get. But I'm serving for God's praise regardless of who sees it or not. Here are some just discussion questions. I'll leave these for your own time, but quickly to go through them. What do expectations we have of others have to do with service? Sometimes we question their motivations, the legitimacy of their need, what they're going to do to pay us back, so to speak. None of those should really factor in. On the other column, what should our perspective be when we serve? Let me give you a little phrase, and you can do this very easily on a Bible Gateway website or app. Look up the phrase, as to the Lord. That phrase, as to the Lord. And you'll find it probably about half a dozen times at least in the New Testament, as to the Lord, meaning what we do as to the Lord. We do it to the Lord. Even though the things that are being described are things that we do to other people, the Bible is asking us to consider those are things we are doing to the Lord. And if you want to see how Jesus describes it, Matthew 25, he talks about being hungry, being thirsty, needing food, needing clothing. And the people said, Lord, we never saw you like that. And he said, you did. Other people had those needs, and you either met them or didn't meet them, and by so doing, you either helped or didn't help me. In what way is it true that we get according to how we give? Well, people usually respond in kind. Doing unto others as we would have them do unto us doesn't always mean that they treat us kindly, but in many cases it will. But even if they don't, we still treat them the way that we would want to be treated. And then, this is one that I think is important. How should we examine ourselves before we decide to serve? Again, should we ask and question our own motives? Should we be concerned with more getting or giving? Could we check our judgments? Do we spotlight sometimes, I know this is a problem, we spotlight the flaws in others that are oftentimes the most egregious in ourselves. You know, however you want to describe that. If I think you have a problem with anger, it's probably because I have a problem with anger. Not always 100% true, but a lot of times that's kind of what we do. We see the weaknesses in other people without realizing that those are some of the maybe biggest weaknesses that we have as well. And so we need to be aware of that. Well, that's all of our time for this morning. Thank you for studying with us about serving without expectation, serving in the example of Jesus. We appreciate your good attention. Come back next week. We'll look at another lesson in our series.